Thank you for watching, Katie, and welcome back. And we dive straight into the conversation tonight. And neighboring Tanzania went into an election that was followed by protest, and several were killed in the country. And with that, a few days later, President Samia Suluhu was sworn in as president. But how exactly does the country move forward from that point moving on? A united country is what she said she will work hard towards bringing in. To have this discussion with me is Dismas Mokua, political analyst and security expert. Welcome.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah. So, Dismas, the entire discussion, we've seen reports on the deaths that have been reported in Tanzania. But as we speak now, a country that has the president sworn in, so she's promised to bring unity and move forward as a united Tanzania. How exactly does she do that? How does she convince the very people who have said no to her that it is time for us to move forward?
Well, you know, before you look at the future, it's important to look at the historical perspectives. When you look at when Africa was, countries in Africa were attaining the independence, we had countries which had very powerful political parties. One can talk about the African National Congress in South Africa. One can talk about Chama cha Mapinduzi in Tanzania, and one would easily talk about KANU in Kenya. So we've had some political parties that have been very strong, very powerful. Now, unfortunately, for some reason, KANU is not very strong, but CCM and African National Congress are very strong. But when you look at the African National Congress, it's slowly losing its grip over South African politics because of status quo. And the leadership of the African National Congress is not necessarily doing sensitivity and scenario analysis to understand that the demographics are changing. Because, you know, they keep on talking about their fight for independence, but majority of their voters do not care that you fought for independence. They're looking for a government which is going to address wealth creation opportunities and employment creation opportunities. And a similar situation is obtaining in Tanzania, with CCM being a very powerful political party. Now, the difference in Tanzania between CCM and other political parties like Chadema or ACT Mzalendo is that CCM is a very powerful political party. It's got grassroots presence and support, and it's very wealthy. I mean, you know, they've been essentially running the system from 1964, or even before then as TANU and Afro-Shirazi political party. So they are very strong. It's probably the only political party in Tanzania that can engage in a nationwide campaign without having resource challenges. And then on this other side, you've got the political parties which have got resource challenges, and then they've got also capacity challenges. They don't have a very solid strategy. That is from the institutional perspective. Then from a personality perspective, unlike Kenya, which has got very powerful politicians, I mean, you can talk about Raila Odinga, who even had the capacity to declare a public holiday. Now you can talk about Mr. Rigathi Gachagua, you can talk about Kalonzo Musyoka, Fred Matiang'i, Martha Karua, Charity Ngilu, that you've got a number of powerful politicians who can look at the administration in the eye and say, Mr. President, you are doing the wrong thing. And then we've also, Kenya's got a very strong judiciary, which can actually stop the president. Our neighbors across Africa get surprised that President Ruto comes up with a declaration or an intervention, and the judiciary tells him, Mr. President, no. Now, for Tanzania to make progress, the people who are going to cause reforms in Tanzania is not going to be the opposition parties. The opposition parties have no capacity nor competence. However, they've got goodwill for coming up with reforms. The person who is going to create reforms in Tanzania is the leadership of CCM. They must sit back and say they were established during independence, they've covered a lot of ground, but demographics are changing. They need to do scenario and sensitivity analysis and take a cue from what has happened in many countries, but we can use a local example. You remember some time ago, Kenya was essentially a single-party democracy, but you know, people went to the streets and said, wait a minute, you need to repeal Section 2A. Then the leadership of KANU did not want anybody talking about repealing Section 2A because they were beneficiaries of status quo. One bright morning, President Moi walks to Kasarani and says, we are going to repeal Section 2A. The whole had a pin drop silence for about 2 minutes. Silence. I mean, nobody was talking because all the delegates, their jaws cumulatively dropped to the ground, and people said, what is President Moi talking about? We repealed Section 2A. You know, the rank and file of Kanu, sycophants had come with their poems, lyrics, saying we must retain Section 2A. But President Moi said, no, we are changing it. Now, we need a similar moment within CCM for them to say that they're changing dynamics. Globally, you know, democracy, there are so many variables that they need to make changes. And it's the founding father of Tanzania called Mwalimu Julius Nyerere.
Yeah.
We even told people that if you want to make changes, don't be in the opposition, come within the political party. So there is merit in the leadership of CCM today, looking at what has taken place the last couple of days, because I suspect majority of them were shocked. So look at what has taken place the last few days and come up and you know, do some reforms. And in my view, high in the priority list would be repealing the electoral laws. For instance, when INEC, the equivalent of the IBC makes a declaration, the word is as good as law, it cannot be challenged. So there's actually merit in reviewing that piece of legislation so that it can be challenged. That is number one.
Is this a point where one would say that based off what has happened, you remember in Kenya 2007, post-election violence that then led to the Constitution 2010, is this a turning point for the country Tanzania for them to relook at the electoral processes and perhaps even other laws that would open up the democratic space in the country?
Well, it's, you know, Rahm Emanuel, who served as the chief of staff for Clinton and recently as the U.S. ambassador to Japan, who said, never ever let a crisis to waste. There's been a crisis in Tanzania, and the leadership of Tanzania cannot let this crisis go to waste. In 2007, 2008, when Kenya had a post-election violence, that is when people sat back and said, wait a minute, can we actually have a solid review of the electoral laws? One of the things we came up with, you recall when President Kibaki was sworn in a few minutes before sunset, people said, this one cannot happen. Let's have a structured piece of legislation. Now, Kenya has got legislation that after a presidential election, results have been declared. There's an elaborate procedure. If you want to complain, you can go to the Supreme Court. Then after the Supreme Court, there's a clear procedure. It has to be done in public between, you know, the time scales have been given very specific. Even for governors, there's even a piece of legislation on the transfer of executive authority, what a cabinet secretary can do, what a PS can do during that process. So there is very good merit, and one can even go to the top of Mount Kenya, in this case, or Mount Kilimanjaro, and say there is merit in the CCM reviewing the leadership. And do not be cheated. The only person who can occasion or catalyze change in Tanzania is going to be CCM. You know, people would come up with a number of variables, come up with stories, but CCM is so strong. You know, they've got something called Nyumba Kumi, the equivalent of what Kagudi was trying to implement in Kenya at some stage, that they are at the machinani level. Yeah. They know everything that is happening. And if they sit down and reflect and say, for the longest time, Tanzania has been considered as, you know, a very politically stable country because they've enjoyed political stability, economic stability, as well as military and security stability for a long time till they got into this turbulence. So there's very good merit in them sitting back and saying, wait a minute, did we make a mistake? There's some things that we did not see. And in doing so, they need to engage everybody. So there's a valid expectation that the CCM leadership will engage citizens, stakeholders, and partners, both within Tanzania and outside Tanzania, for several reasons. Come up with reviews that capture the interests and aspirations of all Tanzanians, and also within EAC. You know, a few days ago, people were saying, wait a minute, why should Kenyans be bothered with what is happening in Tanzania? What they forget is that we've got our border is about 960 kilometers. Yes. You've got Maasai's in Kenya, Maasai's in Tanzania, you've got Luos in Kenya, Luos in Tanzania, Kurias. You've got Kurias. So, you know, essentially it's a very thin line brought out during the Berlin conference. And also as members of the East African community, we essentially have the same passports. So Kenyans have got an insurable interest in what happens in Tanzania, just like Tanzanians have got an insurable interest in what happens in Kenya. Like, for instance, The Tanzanians are coming up with a big real estate project in Upper Hill. So, of course, they've got an interest in what happens in Kenya because they're doing heavy investments. Yes. Tanzania is Tanzania is the biggest FDI supporter of Kenya from the East African community perspective. So they should have an interest in what is happening in Kenya. Just like Kenyans need to have an interest in what is happening in Tanzania, Rwanda, Burundi, Uganda, South Sudan. Anybody who is a member of the East African community, Kenyans must develop a very, very deliberate interest.
Yeah. Yet, over time, we even had the statement by Samia Suluhu, the president, as she was being sworn in, saying she was shocked that some of those who were demonstrating on the streets were neighbors, that coupled up with what happened previously when we saw Kenyans being detained at the airport. Boniface Mwangi saying that he was actually tortured during that time. And one would read that specific statement saying it was targeting Kenyans. And that notwithstanding, with also the, not diplomatic tiff, but the misunderstanding that has been there between Kenyans. Remember John Pombe Magufuli banning Kenyan chicks and all that. And one would say, with what has happened and the statements made by the president, perhaps it is subliminal communication to Kenyans. Should Kenya be worried by the statements, or everything is okay?
Well, in my view, there is no reason for Kenyans to be worried about the statements made by President Suluhu Hassan when she was being sworn into office. She said that there's a probability that some of Tanzanian neighbors have been part of the chaos. But how many neighbors does Tanzania have? There's Kenya, there's Tanzania, there's Burundi, there's Rwanda, there's Mozambique, there's Zambia. So it could be anybody.
Anyone.
And I think Kenyans should only get worried if there's official communication from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Tanzania to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Kenya, then there would be reason for Kenyans to get concerned. Or maybe also Kenyans should be worried if Kenyans are being profiled in Tanzania. The principal responsibility of the head of state in Kenya and head of government is to secure Kenya's lives and properties, whether in Kenya or outside Kenya. Now, if Kenyans are being targeted erroneously in Tanzania, then Kenyans should get concerned. But when the authorities in Tanzania say that they are neighbors, then we shouldn't be worried unless we are saying the guilty are always afraid. And then you also introduce a very important dynamic about intercultural competence. Kenyans are seen to be, for lack of a better word, bullies in the region. If you're going to Tanzania, you're going to Uganda, whichever country you're planning to visit, you must understand the local dynamics before moving out. Like, for instance, if you go to Tanzania and you go to a restaurant and you're very casual in the way you're asking your order, say, naomba taskabaridi. No, not in number. There's a chance that people will look at you and wonder, who the hell is this? You need to be very courteous. There are even some questions you don't ask when you visit our neighbors. So we must develop that intercultural competence to understand the local dynamics. If you visit any country, you need to socialize with their laws, regulations, so that you don't offend what is taking place. Like, for instance, if you're going to the Middle East, understand from the cultures, norms, and expectations, you don't sit with your legs crossed. You don't, display the sole of your shoes because, people may register offense. So before you visit, as a Kenyan, before you visit any country, make sure you understand the legal frameworks. Make sure you understand the do's and don'ts. And indeed, according to what President Suluhu Hassan has indicated, if they were Kenyans, and this is very unlikely. So in the unlikely event that the Kenyans were to cause chaos, then they should be ready to face the rule of law and order. But the probability of that existing is almost zero because Tanzania has got Nyumba Kumi. So the moment you check in, people at the grassroots level will know that you've checked in. And if you've got a group of 100 foreigners coming to your country, of course your intelligence or security system will pick it. It's as if like we are seated here in Nairobi. If you get 100 foreigners coming to cause chaos in Kenya, there's a very high chance that the security infrastructure will pick it up.
Would already know. So let's read Tanzania's future together with the statements that have been given by the EAC observers. We've seen African Union observers as well have given their statement. SADC has given their statement. And all these statements do not speak positively of the elections that have just turned out. Together with other international leaders, Barack Obama has as well spoken on the same. And as all these statements are coming forth, how does Tanzania deal with the geopolitics that are now coming in and the push for them to do right and for democracy to be a reality and not a suggestion?
You see, the leadership of CCM, they actually know exactly what is happening, what has been happening in the last couple of days. And they know very well where Tanzania is today and where they want Tanzania to be tomorrow. So they've got a unique opportunity to get all these reports and consume them with a fair lens, in a very objective manner, and find out from these objectives, do they capture reality, or is there misinformation or disinformation? But you know, all the majority of the observer groups have said that the elections did not necessarily fit the international standards. So one may ask, what are these international standards? I mean, were there errors of omission or commission? And you know, for the election does not actually take place on the material day when you're going to cast your ballot. It's a 5-year process. So they need to review and evaluate that during the last 5 years, has the media been free? I mean, can the media in Tanzania do their work without the fear that, maybe are they intimidated? That is number one. Civil society. Can civil society engage in their work without intimidation? And then for people who want to run for office, whether it's the opposition or within CCM, is there actual internal democracy within CCM? Is there internal democracy within the opposition? And if you're going to participate in political competition, is there an enabling environment for anybody to participate? And it's the same Barack Obama who said that democracy is actually an experiment. Democracy is never perfect. So it's almost a moving target. So you keep on, you keep asking yourself, have we done mistakes? Where can we rectify? So as Ram Emanuel indicated, that never ever let a crisis go to waste. CCM shouldn't let this crisis go to waste. They need to come up with reforms sensitive to their citizens, partners, and stakeholders. Because if they fail to do so, a number of actors are going to remain latent. There'll be latent fury, which may come back to haunt them again in another 5 years' time.
President Samia has a lot of work to bring the country together, one would say, no?
Well, she's actually indicated that when she was being sworn in, there were a number of opposition leaders and the people who ran against her, who attended the swearing in. Never mind how many votes they got, but they still attended. And she said that she's willing to work with anybody in Tanzania who has got good ideas. She indicated she's going to pick their brains, and she said that she's going to engage them in consultations, that anybody who's got a good idea, bring it to the table. So it's incumbent on her, as the first female president in the region, to accommodate divergent interests, accommodate divergent views, not just because you want to make sure that Tanzania is very solid, but because there's a valid expectation on anybody that is the responsibility of a head of state and government to make sure that when citizens, stakeholders, and partners raise issue, you place them on the table and you consider them to see the merits and the demerits. But in my view, having spent a lot of time trying to understand the political situation in Tanzania, having spoken with the scholars and practitioners, there's a very good case for President Suluhu Hassan to listen to divergent views, and because she's serving essentially a second term, probability of her running for another term is 0, going by the Tanzania constitution. She can use these 5 years to midwife the process and ensure that they get probably a new constitution, or on the bare minimum, they come up with the electoral reforms. And at the same time, she must immunize Tanzania from misinformation and disinformation, because with the emergence of the new media, again, there's been a lot of misinformation and disinformation, but the back reel, as it were, stops with the CCM leadership.
Talk about misinformation, disinformation. There was a media blackout, there was internet blackout in the country during that entire process, and that many experts have argued was a way to ensure that the truth is not told to the world. Even today, internet has been opened, but still not to the level that it was before. What do you make of why the sudden blackout?
You know, in the early 60s, and 70s, you would hide the truth in plain view, and nobody would see it. So today, it doesn't matter what you do. The truth today is like a boil. it will come out. Whether or not you try to do anything, it will come out. And it's in the interest of any African leader to ensure that during the electoral process, before and after, you do not step on civil liberties. Because when you don't allow people to engage in communications, whether it's using the legacy media or using the social media, then people will start smelling a rat. In fact, what happens is that you create a vacuum. And when you create a vacuum, then that vacuum is easily filled by misinformation, disinformation, and propaganda.
You know, Tundu Lissu is a subject that we cannot avoid. Should they sit down and iron out the differences and see how Tanzania is moving forward together? And will Tundu Lissu really accept?
Well, you know, we were made to understand that at some stage, Tundu Lissu was a victim of political violence, and he came to Nairobi seeking medical attention. And I recall that it's actually Mama Suluhu Hassan who came to visit Tundu Lissu. So one expects that, again, the CCM leadership will sit and have a conversation with all political actors, not just limited to Tundu Lissu, but all political actors in Tanzania. That would be CCM, Chadema, it would be ACT Wazalendo, you know, all the political parties, all the powerful political personalities, and jointly crafts and executes a strategy on where they want Tanzania to go. Because right now, CCM, according to the results, I mean, they've virtually won every seat. If you're talking about the parliament being 272 seats, they've got 290. So essentially it means that whatever CCM wants is going to become law. That is why there's a case. One can actually go still back to Mount Kilimanjaro and say there's a case for the entire political leadership to sit back. And when they're having this conversation, they should forget everything about their political interests and affiliations and say that we are having these conversations as Tanzanians. Where are we? Where do you want to be? And what must we do to achieve our objectives? If they don't do that, there's going to be latent fury. And also, it will be useful for the CCM to start building bridges with all the people who feel like they've been offended. Because there are a number of people wanted to participate in this electoral process, but for some reason, whether it was errors of omission or commission, they've not participated. So they need to be given a chance. You know, part of the reason why in Kenya we go to the Supreme Court after a presidential election, it's not necessarily that it's going to change the outcome, but it's part of the healing process. You know, people want to speak out, people want to ventilate, and the CCM should create an opportunity for anybody who has anything to ventilate to come out to the open and talk about it.
Tanzania, a long way to go. President Samia Suluhu, a lot of work on her hands to bring the country together. It is a discourse that we continue to follow up on. In studio with me, Dismas Mokua, political analyst and security expert, just having the discussion and engagement on what next for Tanzania. My name is Dennis Aseto. Our sign language interpreter was Meresha Owiti, and to the entire team that made this production a success, Asante Sana, including you, for keeping us company. Enjoy the rest of your viewing. Good night.